I think that there's a real question around affordability of housing across the country. And this is nothing new. I think it's something that as a nation, we should address. And hopefully going forward, the policymakers, the lawmakers will be able to figure out solutions. Now, I think that's only the affordability of housing is only one of these challenges. So I think that has to be addressed. But there's also other big challenges as well, where there's the rental market is very opaque. There's no transparency around what units exist out there, what the application process is, what the screening process is. There's no certification around anyone following fair housing laws. So I think that any legislation or any attempt to really solve the affordability thing and problem, I think that all landlords would agree that it should be part of a bigger push to really address all of the problems in the rental housing market.
You are listening to the Millionacres Podcast. Our mission at Millionacres is to educate and empower investors to make great decisions and achieve real estate investing success. We provide regular content and perspective for everyone from those just starting out to seasoned pros with decades of experience. At Millionacres, we work every day to help you demystify real estate investing and build real wealth. Hello, I'm Deidre Woollard, an editor at Millionacres. Thank you so much for tuning into the Millionacres Podcast. Today, we're looking at the issues that are affecting individual rental property owners. We'll be discussing the eviction moratoriums that sprang up this year, and we'll also talk about the future of rent control and what landlords are kind of most interested in and most concerned about right now. So I'm here today with Ryan Coon, who is the co-founder of Avail, a company that provides services for rental property owners. And he and his team are constantly in contact with thousands of landlords, and so he has a unique perspective on what rental property owners need to be more prepared for right now and what's really on their minds. So Ryan, thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you right now.
So let's get right into it. I really wanted to have a conversation about, just to start off with, the eviction moratoriums. We've got the federal eviction moratorium that's expiring at the end of the year. We don't have a second stimulus package at the time that we're recording this. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. So what are you hearing from landlords?
Yeah, that's right. As you mentioned, there's so much that is expiring at the end of the year with the eviction moratorium, the extended unemployment benefits. And so I think overall, there's just a lot of uncertainty in the market. I think there's a lot of fear around what happens, because sitting here in middle of November, we're also currently seeing a spike in COVID cases across the country. So people are just generally uncertain around what the future holds.
And so are you thinking that some landlords just at the point where they're almost ready to give up? Are they really feeling the pressure right now? And how worried are they about next year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here at Avail, what we do is we really focus on helping non-institutional landlords manage their residential rentals. And so landlords from all over the country are using Avail. We have conversations with them every single day. And I think overall, what we found is over the last 8 months, we've been having more and more of these conversations around how are they feeling, what's going on. We recently surveyed our landlords in October to actually understand, current state, what's happening. And what they're telling us overall is that a lot of them have not been receiving nearly as much rent as they were previously. I think especially with COVID and with unemployment where it is today, landlords are unfortunately not receiving the same amount they were before. And for landlords who are receiving less rent, that's actually unfortunately forcing some landlords to have to consider selling their units. I think the second effect of what's going on right now is we're also seeing that landlords are tightening their screening criteria. So when they're actually looking to rent out their units, they're being much more selective, almost to the extent of having a vacancy rather than taking a renter who may or may not have a stable financial future.
Interesting. So it's really a tough time for landlords to try to find those people as well. So in terms of it's kind of a good time to sell right now in terms of the residential real estate market. But are landlords hesitant to do that? Are they trying to other options, maybe refinancing or trying to figure out another way to keep their properties?
Yeah, well, I think what's important to note is that these individual landlords, they are at the core, they're entrepreneurs. They're small business owners. They're the fabric of their local community. And I think a lot of them, for better or for worse, are they're somewhat stubborn, right? They're entrepreneurs. They're good, hardworking individual people, and they generally are trying to find a way to make it work. I think one of the things that we're seeing through this is that overall, whether it's on the landlord side or the renter side, people are generally doing the right thing. So what I mean by that is landlords are working with their renters. They're trying hard to find rent deferment plans or partial payment plans, or like trying to figure out a way to make it work. On the renter side, because of the CDC eviction moratorium, I think there was a lot of fear among landlords early on that renters would take advantage of the situation. We're also not seeing that happen. So I think that landlords and tenants, by and large, are trying to find a way to make this work. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of landlords currently are trying to find ways to refinance their units. Maybe they are putting off a little bit of that maintenance that they had planned. They're generally really creative, crafty, trying to figure out how to get by right now while maintaining ownership of their units.
Interesting. So we talked about the federal eviction moratorium, but there are also state eviction moratorium. There's individual cities. I've heard of some states, letting the eviction moratorium expire and then reinstating it because the courts got flooded with evictions. So are landlords having a hard time finding out information on what is and what isn't legal right now?
Yeah, that is one of the bigger challenges. I think that it's like anything else right now during this unusual time where this is really just, I think COVID is exposing a lot of issues that have always existed in the rental market. So what I mean by that is the rental market has always had all of these different legislations, different rules and clauses and local ordinances and stuff. And unfortunately, that can cause a lot of confusion for landlords and real estate investors. And so I think that right now what we're seeing is just that problem being exacerbated because of COVID, because of these different eviction moratoriums, because there's no one national kind of unifying order around what can and cannot be happening.
Well, that's true. And another thing that I've heard from some of the housing organizations is that there hasn't really been a lot of landlord support. We see these eviction moratoriums and there's been support for renters. Individual cities have come up with programs, but there's not really anything on certainly on the national scale, but even in most areas to really support landlords that are experiencing these types of problems.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, if you think about the overall ecosystem, where you've got landlords on one part of the market, on one half of the market, then you've got renters on the other. And the way that, like most markets, it functions is that the renters are the consumers, they're the customer, and they need to purchase or buy the product. And in this case, the product is shelter, and it's a place to live. And if the renters don't have the income that they need to be able to pay for that shelter, well, that's a big problem. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for evictions, because I think one of the best things that has happened is the eviction moratorium, right? Because we do need to, for safety, for all of the other reasons, we need to make sure that people remain housed. But to your point, when that eviction moratorium comes into play, that's only focused on one part of the problem. It does not address the needs or the support that landlords currently need in the market. And landlords need support too. And that support really is, I think, designed around two things. So number one, how do we give them the resources they need to repair and maintain their units in order to keep them safe, keep them habitable, keep them places that humans can live? And then number two, I think, going back to my comment about these individual landlords being the fabric of the community, it's really important that we recognize just how important these individuals are and how much they do contribute. These are individuals who shop at the local stores. They give back in the community. They're leaders. And so I think as a nation, we should all rally around the idea that these landlords we should do what it takes to help them maintain ownership of their units rather than, on the extreme, have big Wall Street landlords come in and buy up all the rentals, because I think there's a lot of issues and a lot of challenges that come when that happens.
Yeah, certainly we've seen some of those stories in the news. And I really love what you said there because I think that's really very true. And so, in terms of getting help, have you seen landlords taking advantage of certain programs? Have they been using like the PPP loans or anything like that?
Yeah, different landlords across the country are reacting a little bit differently. Unfortunately, the PPP program did not explicitly call out landlords as an eligible category. So what we're seeing more of is landlords actually taking advantage of mortgage forbearance. And they've been able to defer making payments on their mortgage, which is a short-term band-aid. Now, unfortunately, though, those payments do still need to be made up at some point, whether it's a balloon at the end of the deferment period or if they just get tacked onto the end of the mortgage. So I think that forbearance option that is on federally backed mortgages is one of the strengths and one of the relief programs out there that landlords have been taking advantage of.
Are there concerns that when some of those forbearances expire, that then people are going to slip into foreclosure? Certainly, we've seen a lot of data lately that indicates individual homeowners may be struggling with what happens when their forbearance programs expire.
Yeah, that's one of the big fears. I mean, I think that over these next few months are critical, because what we're finding, and as we looked at our October survey data, what we found is that roughly a third of landlords who responded were already thinking about and feeling pressure to sell their units. And what that indicates to me is that these are individual landlords. They're reaching that breaking point of almost putting their hands up and saying, I give up. I don't know what to do next. And that's unfortunate. And I think that without additional relief, without additional stimulus, there is a real risk that the market that is very fragile right now can fall apart, because at some point, who's going to be on the buy side of those transactions, right? I think that's one of the big concerns. And so if there's not that liquidity in the market, if there's not that buyer willing to go out and buy those rentals, I think that's where you could really see a big problem with foreclosures.
Well, and that's something that I've thought about a lot too, is that the ways that this foreclosure market, if it does happen, if there is a second foreclosure crisis, it'll be very different than the last one because you have those larger institutional landlords that didn't exist at scale, when the last crisis hit, and they do now, and they've already amassed capital. They're ready to go. You've also got iBuyers that are, creating another way for people to sell their homes quickly. So it's going to be a very different time period than it would have been the last crisis.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, I think on the iBuyer side of things, that business, and we've seen it here recently with the Open Door SPAC, or Open Door going public via SPAC and stuff. I mean, that business, unfortunately, like has pros and cons to it, but I think has been a difficult business over the last few years as the housing market has been very robust. But I think that as landlords maybe start feeling more and more pressure to sell, the spread and the fee that they would have to pay to an iBuyer potentially would really, that margin would be pretty wide there. And so it's going to put a lot of downward pressure. And I do get concerned about these big institutional landlords coming in. I think that there's a real risk that, especially on the affordable side of the housing market, there's a real risk that we lose inventory over the coming years, which would be really unfortunate, would further drive up prices and make the rental crisis even worse in the country than it was maybe even pre-pandemic.
Interesting. And I know we're also seeing rents drop in some of the big cities, in San Francisco, in New York, and I've heard that there's some multifamily owners are having trouble finding tenants. Are you hearing that from landlords, that there's a difference now between single family landlords and multifamily?
Yeah, anecdotally, we do hear some of that. I mean, I think our core customer is the landlords that we typically work with are not the big multifamily owners. But I have had some of those conversations. And I think what's happening for the most part is two things. Number one, um, potentially on the big institutional side, these past few years have been really good for business. I mean, there's been a building boom. There have been a lot of new inventory of rental units come on the market, and now those units, frankly, aren't as attractive as before because of number two. And I think number two is that on the renter side, on the tenant side, if you've got the option to live in a single family home where there's one entrance, one exit that you and your family are using, um, the perception is that that's a lot safer and cleaner than living in a big multifamily, tall apartment building, big apartment complex. And then also, I think a lot of these big multifamily properties, they've got amenity spaces and gyms and pools and stuff that you just can't, we're not able to use right now. And I think that makes those multifamily properties a lot less attractive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they tend to be smaller units. Everybody has needed more space this year from being at home, so that's definitely a shift that's been happening. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about rent control, just because this year it was on the ballot in California and did not pass. But I know Portland, Oregon, I believe, has passed some form of rent control. So it's something that has. It seems to me that it goes in cycles. Concerns about rent control and what that means for landlords. So what are you hearing right now? Is there some anxiety from landlords about the ways that there could be more legislation in 2021?
Yeah, well, I think this is another really important type of or example of a situation that um, COVID and the current pandemic is just shedding light on an issue and a topic that's always been there. I think that there's a real question around affordability of housing across the country. And this is nothing new. I think it's something that as a nation we should address. And hopefully going forward, the policymakers, the lawmakers will be able to figure out solutions. Now, I think that's only the affordability of housing is only one of these challenges. So I think that has to be addressed. But there's also other big challenges as well, where there's the rental market is very opaque. There's no transparency around what units exist out there, what the application process is, what the screening process is. There's no certification around anyone following fair housing laws. So I think that any legislation or any attempt to really solve the affordability thing and problem, I think that all landlords would agree that it should be part of a bigger push to really address all of the problems in the rental housing market.
Interesting, because you that makes me think about rental registries, because we had a piece on the site recently about that, and right now it's still so it's you're right, it's absolutely vague. You don't really know how many units there are in any market. Certainly, if you're an individual trying to search for a rental property, you're still left with a lot of the same solutions that you were left with, 10 years ago. People are still, transacting or finding rentals on Craigslist, which is sort of amazing to me. So I think that there's a lot of potential for things to get a little more cohesive.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's one of the things that we've been focused on a lot here at Avail, right? Is um, the residential rental market here in the US, there's about 48 million rental units. Now, half of that market is very organized, it's institutionally owned, it's professionally managed. The other half of the market here in the US is owned and managed by men and women like us, who are these busy professionals, they're part-time landlords, and it's really these individuals that there's that lack of cohesion and the really opaque part of the market. In a lot of ways, it operates like the Wild West, right? Where everyone does things their own way. There's no standardization around process. There's no information. Back to the earlier discussion around the laws and the regulations and stuff. No one really knows what they should and shouldn't be doing. And that's where I think something like a rental registry or a more uniform set of standards in the market would be really powerful and game changing.
I totally agree. All right, this is a great place to take a break. So when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the trends that are impacting real estate investors. We hope you are enjoying this and every episode of Millionacres Podcast. If you have a moment, we'd love to hear from you. Please visit millionacarespodcast.fool.com and tell us what you think of the podcast so far, what kind of content and guests you'd like to hear, and what else we can do to help you grow smarter, happier, and richer through real estate. Welcome back to the Millionacres Podcast. We're here talking with Ryan Coon, co-founder of Avail, a company that provides technology solutions for rental property owners and landlords. So there's been a lot of talk about people leaving big cities. Is that something that your landlords are concerned about? Are you seeing more rural landlords? What are you seeing sort of geographically?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of news and a lot of headlines around this, where there's this big flight out of major cities. I think what we're seeing, though, and from conversations that I've had, is that that's largely not the case with rentals. And tenants who are typically renting their primary residence are not the ones fleeing these big cities. I think the people fleeing tend to be maybe more middle income, upper income homeowners, individuals. And so what we're hearing is that landlords generally are not scared about this. I do think also going forward that these big cities, that we've seen this more urbanization trend over the last 20 years, I think that'll come back. Earlier today, I was actually on the phone with someone in New Zealand. And New Zealand has largely contained the pandemic. And as a country, they're more or less back to normal. And trends that were happening pre-pandemic are continuing along just as they were before COVID hit. And so I look at that and I really believe that the urbanization trend will continue. We're not going to have a bunch of big empty cities across the country.
I would agree with that. So speaking of the pandemic, one of the things that it has definitely caused, certainly there was an interest in online payments and things like that before, and virtual tours and all of that, but the pandemic kind of put that into hyperspeed. So obviously Avail has probably been part of that. I'm sure that when the pandemic hit, you had a lot of landlords that wanted to find out about how to do online payments like immediately. How have you been kind of adapting to that and helping those landlords that didn't really think they needed technology figure it out?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, I would say it's been a lot of fun and really exciting last 8 months or so for us here at Avail. As you mentioned, landlords are finally starting to really embrace and adopt technology. Historically, these individual, what we call do-it-yourself landlords, have been largely the ones that have been using paper checks and Excel spreadsheets and stuff. And it's been exciting for us as a business to really see and to be helpful for these individuals as they really do try and bring their rental business online. Because as I mentioned earlier, owning a rental unit or a rental property is a small business. It should be treated that way. And so I think that what we're seeing is just this acceleration of the technology adoption, which is ultimately helping these landlords save more time and providing their customers, the renters, an overall better experience. And we're just really fortunate and happy to see that trend happening and to be helpful along the way.
Well, and I think another factor too is it does kind of help them compete with these larger institutional property owners that can provide those types of services and provide virtual tours and online payments and make everything easier. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because one of our writers who is a small-time landlord wrote a piece on Million Acres about how the individual can kind of compete with those bigger landlords. And so are you also hearing that landlords want to know how they can compete and how they can sort of make themselves kind of appear bigger than they are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I read Laura's piece. I think it was a phenomenal way of really saying and laying out how these individual landlords can separate themselves from the institutional owners. I think her article really focused on, um, rather than playing down the I'm an individual landlord, and you may look at a bigger institutional landlord as being more attractive. I think her piece actually made a good argument for why individual landlords have an advantage and should lean into that, really to differentiate, because ultimately tenants do, by and large, prefer renting from an individual that they can reach out to. We are a very people-centric species, and so having that individual landlord that you can reach out to when something happens is much more attractive for renters than having to call up or message this like big nameless, faceless corporation. So I agree with that. And then I think on the more investor side of things, because I know this is an investing podcast. And so one of the things that I talk with landlords about a lot is that it's important to keep in mind that these institutional owners, these big invitation homes, these big like REITs that go in and buy up swaths of single family homes, the thing to keep in mind is that they need a certain amount of scale in a market to make that market work. And I've heard these numbers anywhere from 1,000 homes up to 5,000 homes in a market. And there's certain cities across the country where that dynamic exists, and they can really easily, quickly go in and buy up big bulk purchases of single family homes. But for individual investors like all of us here on the podcast and in the audience, I think there's really an opportunity for us to go out and look in some of those smaller markets and find units and find homes that the big REITs simply wouldn't be able to go in and play in and compete in.
That is a really good point because you're absolutely right. Those REITs tend to focus on top 20 markets or something like that. They don't necessarily go anywhere where they can't make a profit at scale. So there really is still that opportunity for non-institutional landlords to kind of find those other places in the country. And I heard that you're working with the Urban Institute on tracking some of that non-institutional landlord data, and I feel like that's a really important thing because, as we've talked about on this podcast, they really are the fabric of community. And so I'm wondering, are you seeing less small landlords being interested in it? It's a tough business. Certainly, there's been some kind of the aging of America trend also affects landlords. But I've also heard a lot of millennials who are kind of interested in house hacking, or I know several people actually on our team who got their start by buying a property and renting out half of it or something like that. So, what are you really seeing?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and really, what's been amazing for me this year over 2020, for as many challenges as we've all faced, one of the things that we as a business here at Avail have done, which has been a lot of fun and interesting, is leaning in more on the data that we're collecting and gathering. And so our partnership with Urban Institute's a great example of this. And here, even next week, we will be making public a lot of the information and the data that we're capturing. So anyone in the audience, they can go to avail.co/data, and they'll be able to check out rent trends, rent prices by market. And so to your question around aging, I think what we're finding is that landlords, real estate investors, and even broader than that, investors overall have always sought out ways to make money and to invest and to earn a reasonable return. And I think that millennials and maybe boomers, I mean, we're seeing that interest in real estate be as high as it's ever been. I think that landlords now, the only difference is they're actually looking to maybe leverage technology in order to build a more scalable business that will operate smoother, that maybe they don't have to go out and spend as much time on, and truly make it the passive income stream that it should be.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons that all of us on the team are so passionate about real estate is that idea of using it to build wealth and to build, build opportunities for ourselves and our families. And that's why one of the things that I want to ask you about is diversity in the landlord community. I know you've done some research on this, and I also know that the COVID-19 crisis has kind of disproportionately impacted people of color who are landlords. And I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, this is one of these really unfortunate things that we have seen happen this year, and we've dug into the data. And I think what we're finding is that overall, the Black and the Hispanic landlords out there in the market, they have been disproportionately impacted by what's happening right now. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I think that unfortunately, these populations have lower wages and less savings to begin with. And what that's causing then is when their renters are maybe behind on rent or unable to pay rent, it's unfortunately these Black and Hispanic landlords that are not able to dip into their savings, or they're not able to lean on their own personal wages as much. I think a third factor in there is that people in these populations are also more likely to own 2 to 4 unit rental properties that are tend to be more affordable housing. They tend to house more people who have been hit by COVID-19 disproportionately. They are the hospitality workers and the restaurant workers. And so when the renters, bringing us full circle, aren't able to afford the rent payments, but the landlord still has to pay to keep up the unit and pay the mortgage, it's unfortunately these people that are starting from a worse situation that are less able to absorb some of that impact. Now, the one thing I will say, and that has been just amazing to see in the data, is that while these Black and Hispanic landlords have been very much disproportionately hit during COVID, it's also what's surprising is that it's these populations, the Black and Hispanic landlords, that are the most willing to work with their renters to come up with rent deferral programs. They're more willing to negotiate. And I think that really speaks to just how community focused a lot of these individuals are. And it's something that we've heard firsthand accounts of. I mean, these populations, for as hard as they've been hit, they're maybe the most resilient folks out there. And it's really incumbent on, I think, all of us as a broader community to really reach out and to try and help and figure out how we can support them.
I absolutely agree with that. I think what you mentioned there about community is just so important, and you can't really replace that. And I think that's one of the reasons that individual landlords and a diverse landlord base is really important to a community, because the landlord base should also reflect the tenant base. And if you don't have that match there, it does change the fabric of a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think we as a group, as a nation, I think it's really important for us to all think about how do we spread the word around financial independence and financial freedom and financial education, which I know is such a huge part of what you guys do here at Million Acres and broadly speaking at the Motley Fool. And I think that mission and that goal is just so empowering.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard for people to make that first step. Certainly one of the things that's an issue for individual landlords is getting financing and learning how to kind of how to do it, because I mean anyone who's ever tried to get into owning property and then trying to rent out property, you're kind of on your own a little bit.
Yeah, that's really ultimately one of the things that we try and do here at Avail is we try and spread some of that knowledge, some of that information that a lot of us have gone through and we've learned the hard way. And so trying to figure out how do we share that with perhaps the next generation of real estate investors and landlords out there.
Well, that's kind of a great place to wrap up here. I wanted to know if you can kind of share some encouraging words for anyone looking into getting into rentals or just expanding. I mean, we've talked about some of the bad things. We know that there's going to be, it's going to be a little bit of a rough year, but I think there's a lot also to be encouraged about. So, what would you tell someone who's kind of looking to build their rental property investing portfolio?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably two comments and two things that I would recommend. So number one is even a bit of a history lesson. And we go back to the 1918 Spanish flu. And that was an awful global pandemic. But what followed shortly thereafter was the Roaring 20s. And it was one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. And so I look at that and that's almost the light at the end of the tunnel for me, because personally, there is a lot of pain and tragedy and things going on all around us and stuff. And it can be really depressing and you can get into your own head around how bad things are. But it's important to realize that things will get better. And now as it relates to real estate investing and getting involved, the couple of things I would say is like, number one, take that first step. Reach out to someone that you know who has done it. Ask for help, ask for guidance, ask how they did it. Everyone in this business is really interested in sharing what they've learned. That's one of the things that I've learned. And then number two, I think it's really important to be a foolish investor and invest for the long term and be patient and be deliberate and make investments in things that you would want to be proud to own 10 years from now, and take that long view while keeping in mind that things will get better and that there's a lot of prosperity ahead.
I love that. Thank you so much. And that's a perfect place to end this. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really great conversation. And just a reminder for our listeners, you can learn more about rental properties on the Millionacres website, and you can head over to Avail to check out their research at avail.co.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Millionacres Podcast. I hope you liked today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing through your favorite podcast provider. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line at help@millionacres.com. Stay well and stay invested. People on this program may have an interest in the deals, offerings, or services they discuss, and Millionacres or the Motley Fool may have a formal recommendation for or against. Always consult a certified tax professional before acting on tax advice, and do not buy or sell assets based solely on what you hear.